You don't need friends after 70. The Buddhist wisdom on letting go and finding inner peace. Have you ever stopped to consider that everything you've been told about friendship and happiness might only be half the truth? We've all been conditioned to believe that our happiness and sense of belonging depend on the people around us. But what if the real key to fulfillment, especially after 70, isn't about adding more people to your circle, but about learning to let go? In our fast-paced, always connected world, we've been told that the more friends we have, the happier we'll be. Social media bombards us with images of groups of people having fun, thriving in their friendships, and living their best lives. But deep down, we know that there's more to life than simply seeking the approval of others. Buddha, in his infinite wisdom, once said, "You cannot travel the path until you have become the path itself." True peace doesn't come from the number of friendships we maintain, but from the depth of peace we cultivate within ourselves. In this journey, we'll explore the profound Buddhist wisdom on why friendships may become less essential as we age, and how learning to embrace solitude can bring us closer to inner peace. This isn't just about giving up your friendships, it's about discovering a new way of connecting with yourself, with the world, and with the quiet moments that hold so much beauty. 1. The shift from external validation to inner peace. We journey through life. There comes a point when we realize that the constant chase for validation, especially from others, is not the answer to true fulfillment. For most of our lives, we are conditioned to seek approval first from our parents, then from our peers, colleagues, and friends. We measure our worth by the number of people who acknowledge us, by the likes we receive on social media, and by the recognition we gain in our careers. For a long time, it feels as though the key to happiness lies in being liked, respected, and admired by those around us. We believe that our social circles define us, and the more people we surround ourselves with, the more valuable we become. But as we grow older, particularly when we cross the threshold of 70, a transformation takes place, often quietly and unexpectedly. We begin to feel the weight of the years spent performing for others, putting on a mask to fit in, and chasing relationships that were never truly ours to begin with. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It's subtle, almost imperceptible at first, like a soft whisper telling us that there is another way to live, a more peaceful and authentic way. Take the example of Harold, a man who spent his entire life climbing the corporate ladder, surrounded by colleagues, friends, and acquaintances. He defined his self-worth by the number of people he knew and the respect he received. His life was a whirlwind of meetings, social gatherings, and business dinners. He believed that his success was directly linked to how many people sought his company, how many emails filled his inbox, and how many phone calls he received. But when Harold retired, the familiar noise of a busy life suddenly quieted. The constant stream of messages stopped, and the invitations to social gatherings faded away. The friendships that once seemed so essential slowly vanished, and Harold was left alone with his own thoughts. At first, he tried to hold on to the relationships he had, reaching out to old friends and trying to maintain connections out of habit. But soon, he began to question, why was he clinging to these relationships? What was it about them that made him feel valuable? Were these connections built on true friendship, or had they been based on convenience, professional necessity, or the desire to be seen? Slowly, Harold began to realize that the friendships he had been nurturing weren't as deep or meaningful as he had once thought. They were relationships that were tied to the idea of validation, and once that external validation was gone, they no longer held the same significance. This realization was jarring, even painful at first. Harold missed the social buzz, the constant sense of belonging that came with being surrounded by people. In the stillness of his home, the quiet mornings, filled with the absence of emails and phone calls, he felt a sense of loneliness. Doubts crept in. Was he irrelevant now? Had he become invisible? Was his life still meaningful without the approval of others? But then, one morning, as Harold took his usual walk in the park, something remarkable happened. He noticed an elderly man sitting alone on a bench, watching the world go by. The man had no phone in his hands, no one beside him, yet he seemed perfectly at peace. There was a serenity in his solitude that Harold had never seen before. Driven by curiosity, Harold approached him and struck up a conversation. The man, whose name was George, shared a story that would change Harold's life forever. George told Harold that he had once been just like him, constantly surrounded by people, always needing to feel important, always seeking validation. But over time, he realized that his worth wasn't measured by the number of people in his life. Instead, it was measured by how at peace he was with himself. George explained that true happiness comes not from others but from within. "It took me a long time to learn," George said with a gentle smile, "but I don't need anyone else to tell me I matter. I know it for myself." In that moment, Harold's perspective shifted. What if he stopped seeking approval from others? What if he could simply be, without the pressure to perform, to impress, or to maintain relationships out of obligation? What if the key to fulfillment lay not in surrounding himself with more people, but in finding peace within himself? The days that followed were filled with quiet reflection. Harold began to embrace the stillness, allowing himself to enjoy the simple pleasures of lifelong walks, moments of solitude, and the joy of rediscovering hobbies he had once neglected. He started practicing meditation, a practice he had always dismissed in his busy years. Slowly, the void he had once felt began to fill with a deep sense of calm. He found peace in the silence, a peace he had never known before. He realized that he didn't need to chase after friendships or external validation to feel fulfilled. He was enough just as he was. This journey wasn't easy. There were days when Harold still felt the sting of loneliness, when the absence of social events felt like an empty space. But over time, he learned to embrace that emptiness. He discovered that the quiet moments, the times spent alone, were where his most profound realizations came from. He found himself less concerned with what others thought of him and more focused on what truly mattered: his own happiness, his own sense of peace, and his own growth. Harold's story is not unique. It is a story that many of us will eventually face as we age. The truth is that the friendships we hold dear in our younger years may no longer serve us in the same way as we grow older. But rather than viewing this as a loss, it can be seen as an opportunity for growth. We are given the chance to let go of the external noise, to stop seeking approval, and to embrace the beauty of solitude. In letting go of the need to prove ourselves to others, we open ourselves up to a deeper, more authentic form of happiness. We learn to be content with who we are, independent of the approval or recognition of others. And in doing so, we cultivate a peace that no one can take away, a peace that comes from within. As you reflect on your own life, ask yourself, do I still need to prove myself to anyone? What would happen if I let go of the constant need for validation and simply embraced who I am, right here, right now? The answer, I believe, is that you would find a peace so profound that it would change the way you see the world. You would discover that true happiness is not found in the approval of others, but in the quiet acceptance of yourself. So let go of the need to prove your worth. Let go of the friendships that no longer serve you. And in doing so, allow yourself to experience a peace that is yours to keep forever. 2. The power of letting go. Freedom through solitude. As we grow older, we often find that the things we once valued and relied upon start to lose their importance. In our youth, we are taught that socializing, keeping up with friendships, and staying connected with others are the keys to happiness. Social gatherings, dinners, phone calls, and messages become markers of our worth, and we measure our success by the size of our social circle. But with time, as we age and reflect on our lives, we begin to realize that these once essential aspects of our existence are no longer as fulfilling as they once were. The energy that was once spent on maintaining friendships and socializing feels increasingly draining rather than invigorating. This is when the beauty of solitude begins to emerge, not as something to be feared, but as a source of freedom. Take Margaret's experience, for example. In her younger years, Margaret was always surrounded by a bustling social network. She attended countless gatherings, celebrated birthdays, and participated in endless conversations that were more about social obligation than genuine connection. For years, she believed that these interactions were necessary for her happiness. After all, that's what society had taught. Her happiness is in being busy, in being wanted, in being needed by others. She thought that in order to feel alive, she had to be constantly engaging with others, sharing stories, and making plans. However, as Margaret entered her later years, she started to feel a shift. The endless cycle of social engagements that once brought her a sense of purpose now left her feeling drained. The dinner parties, the phone calls that didn't really matter, the repetitive conversations that didn't nourish her soul. These activities began to lose their meaning. She found herself going through the motions, showing up at events because it was expected, not because she genuinely wanted to be there. Over time, the joy she once felt in these interactions was replaced with a quiet sense of exhaustion. It wasn't just physical tiredness, it was an emotional and mental fatigue, a sense of emptiness that lingered long after the events had ended. One evening, after yet another tiring dinner, Margaret sat quietly in her living room, reflecting on her life. She asked herself a question that she had never truly considered before. Why am I doing this? Why was she still attending events that no longer brought her joy? Why was she maintaining friendships that didn't align with her values or desires anymore? The answer came to her almost instantly. She had been holding on to these social obligations out of guilt, out of fear of being left out, and out of a desire to fit into the expectations that others had for her. The weight of these responsibilities had gradually built up, and she realized that she had been living her life for others, not for herself. Margaret's realization was a turning point. She decided to take a radical step. She began to let go of the social engagements that no longer served her. She stopped feeling guilty for declining invitations that didn't resonate with her. At first, the quiet of her home felt unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. She missed the noise, the chatter, the busyness that had once defined her life. But as the weeks went by, something extraordinary began to happen. The stillness, which she had once feared, began to feel comforting. The time she had once spent in crowded rooms now became precious moments for herself. She rediscovered her love for reading books she had always meant to finish but had never had the time for. She began to explore new hobbies, things that she had set aside in favor of social obligations. Margaret started taking long walks in nature, where she could immerse herself in the quiet beauty around her. There was something profoundly calming about being alone in the world, surrounded by the sounds of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the rhythm of her own footsteps. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to be fully present in these moments. She learned to enjoy her own company, without the need for constant distractions. In the solitude, Margaret found a peace that she had long been searching for. The clarity that had been obscured by the noise of her busy social life began to emerge. She realized that true happiness didn't come from the validation of others or from being surrounded by people. It came from within. She had spent so many years trying to meet the expectations of those around her, but in doing so, she had neglected herself. The quiet, the stillness, and the time she spent alone gave her the space to reconnect with who she truly was. She found that her worth wasn't defined by her social status or the number of people she knew. It was defined by her ability to be content with herself. Margaret's journey toward embracing solitude was not without its challenges. At times, she still felt the pull of old habits there, temptation to attend events out of obligation, to reconnect with people simply because they were familiar. But as she grew more accustomed to the peace that solitude brought, she began to recognize the beauty in it. She realized that solitude wasn't a form of isolation. It was a space of self-discovery and renewal. It was in these quiet moments that she found the deepest connection, not with others, but with herself. Through her experience, Margaret learned that peace comes from within, and that solitude is not something to be feared. In fact, it is a gift, a chance to reconnect with who we are and what truly matters. The pressure to always be social, to maintain a certain image, to live up to others' expectations can be overwhelming. But when we learn to let go of these pressures, we create space for a more meaningful, authentic existence. As Margaret's story shows, embracing solitude can lead to a profound sense of peace. It allows us to let go of the external noise and distractions that often cloud our judgment. It teaches us that happiness is not dependent on the approval of others, but on our ability to find contentment within ourselves. In a world that often tells us that we need to be constantly connected, constantly busy, and constantly surrounded by people to feel fulfilled, learning to embrace solitude is one of the most powerful ways to reclaim our peace and our joy. So, if you find yourself feeling overwhelmed by the demands of social life, take a step back. Allow yourself the space to simply be. Explore the quiet beauty that solitude offers. It is in these moments of stillness that we can truly hear our own hearts, reconnect with our true selves, and find the peace we've been seeking all along. Let go of the need to fill every moment with activity and social interaction. Instead, allow the silence to become a source of healing, growth, and transformation. 3. The freedom to live authentically as we age. We often find ourselves at a crossroads, questioning the relationships that have once been the center of our lives. The friendships we once cherished may no longer feel as fulfilling, and the constant effort to maintain social connections may leave us feeling drained and disconnected from our true selves. This realization can be uncomfortable at first, as we are taught to believe that our value is determined by the quantity of our relationships. Yet, with time, we come to understand a profound truth. Fewer friendships, when nurtured with authenticity, mean fewer disappointments. The key to finding peace in our later years lies not in the number of people we call friends, but in the depth and quality of the relationships we choose to keep. Letting go of relationships that no longer serve us, whether because of incompatibility, neglect, or simply because they no longer bring joy, allows us to make room for connections that are more meaningful and true. These are the relationships that are grounded in mutual respect, understanding, and shared values, not in obligation or convenience. As we shed the weight of relationships that have faded or become one-sided, we give ourselves the freedom to cultivate deeper, more authentic bonds. Take the example of William, a man who spent his youth and much of his middle age nurturing friendships that he thought were essential to his happiness. He gave tirelessly to others, always the one to initiate, contact, check in, and offer support. Yet, as time passed, William began to notice that many of the friendships he had invested in were becoming increasingly one-sided. His friends had moved on, found new paths, or simply lost interest. He found himself sitting alone, wondering why. He was the only one still holding on to the past. There were no calls, no messages, no invitations, just silence. It was a silence that was not filled with peace, but with disappointment and sorrow. He had given so much of himself to these relationships, yet they had faded away, leaving him feeling invisible. At first, William struggled with this realization. He missed the connections he had once shared with these people. He felt hurt, questioning his worth, and wondering why he had been the one left behind. But slowly, he began to understand a profound lesson that Buddha had taught. Let go, or be dragged. Holding on to relationships that no longer served him only caused him pain. He realized that these friendships had not been built on mutual respect or a true emotional bond, but on familiarity and convenience. It was time to let them go. The decision to release these outdated friendships was not easy. It required him to confront the fear of loneliness, the fear that letting go meant losing something vital. But as William began to let go, something remarkable happened. He discovered that with fewer friendships came fewer expectations, fewer obligations, and, most importantly, fewer disappointments. The friends he had held on to out of habit had come with unspoken expectations, and when those expectations were not met, it led to hurt and frustration. By releasing those relationships, William freed himself from the cycle of disappointment and opened the door to more fulfilling and authentic connections. In the space left behind by the relationships he had let go, William found new opportunities. For growth, he reconnected with an old neighbor, a fellow gardener, and they shared meaningful conversations about the earth, life, and everything in between. Their friendship was built on mutual respect and shared interests, not on the obligations of the past. This new friendship was not forced, nor did it come with expectations. It simply was. It was a bond that brought joy, not because they had to make each other happy, but because they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. In addition to this new connection, William discovered the richness of solitary activities. He found joy in painting, a hobby he had abandoned years ago, and in meditation, which brought him a sense of peace he had never known before. These solo pursuits allowed him to connect with himself on a deeper level, and in doing so, he found that he didn't need to be surrounded by a large group of people to feel fulfilled. His life, once so defined by his relationships with others, had become more meaningful as he learned to nurture his relationship with himself. The fewer people William tried to please, the more space he had to nurture the relationships that mattered most. He no longer felt the pressure to maintain friendships out of obligation, and he was no longer disappointed when relationships faded or when people moved on. Instead, he embraced the impermanence of life and the beauty of change. He understood that, just as the seasons change, so do relationships. People come and go, and that is not something to be feared. It is simply a part of life. By letting go of the need to hold on to friendships that no longer brought him joy, William found freedom. He could now focus on what truly mattered, cultivating a deeper connection with himself. And with the few people who shared his values, he realized that he didn't need a large circle of friends to feel fulfilled. Instead, he found peace in having a few meaningful connections, and most importantly, in knowing that he could live authentically, without the pressure of meeting anyone's expectations. As we navigate through life, it becomes increasingly clear that fewer friendships often lead to fewer disappointments. By letting go of relationships that no longer serve us, we create space for more genuine, meaningful connections. This doesn't mean abandoning friendships or isolating ourselves. Rather, it means recognizing when certain relationships have run their course and allowing ourselves to move on without guilt or regret. It means embracing the people who truly enrich our lives and letting go of those who do not. Ultimately, the quality of our friendships is far more important than the quantity. When we allow ourselves the freedom to shed the relationships that have lost their purpose, we find that we are left with the connections that truly matter. These are the relationships that nourish our souls, bring us joy, and help us grow. And in the end, it is these friendships, these authentic connections, that provide us with the peace and fulfillment we have been searching for all along. For true companionship begins within us. We grow older, time takes on a new significance. In our youth, time seems limitless. There's always tomorrow to do the things we put off today, and our days are filled with endless activity, often spent pursuing external achievements and accumulating experiences. We waste hours, days, and even years on things that don't truly fulfill us, always thinking that there will be more time to chase our dreams, to connect with loved ones, or to embrace life's simple pleasures. But as the years pass, time begins to feel increasingly precious. We come to realize that our time is no longer infinite, and with that realization comes a profound shift in how we spend it. In our younger years, we often say yes to everything at social gatherings, committing to projects, helping others even when it doesn't align with our true desires. We think that by saying yes, we are engaging with life, staying active, and making the most of every moment. But as we enter our later years, especially as we approach our 60s and beyond, we begin to ask ourselves, is this how I want to spend my time? The constant rush to please others, the endless social engagements that leave us feeling drained, the obligations that don't bring us joy suddenly, these things begin to feel like burdens. Time, which once felt abundant, now feels like a precious resource that we cannot afford to waste. Take the example of Richard Mann in his early 80s, who had always been the type to say yes to every invitation, believing that an active social life was the key to staying engaged and living fully. Richard's calendar was filled with dinner parties, gatherings, and endless social events. At first, he felt alive in these situations, surrounded by people, sharing laughter, making connections. But over time, he began to feel the weight of it all. The conversations started to feel repetitive, and the gatherings, once enjoyable, became exhausting. He found himself attending events out of habit rather than desire, feeling more drained than fulfilled. One afternoon, after yet another gathering where the same old stories were retold and the conversations felt shallow, Richard sat in his quiet home, reflecting on his life. He realized that he had spent so much of his time saying yes to obligations, to pleasing others, and to fulfilling social expectations. But what about the things that truly mattered to him? What about the time he had longed to spend on his own passions, on creating, or simply on being still? He had neglected these desires for years, always choosing to prioritize social interaction over personal fulfillment. But it was then that Richard made a pivotal decision. He would no longer fill his time with things that didn't bring him joy. He stopped attending social gatherings out of guilt and instead began to spend his time doing what truly made him feel alive. He rekindled his passion for painting, a hobby he had abandoned years ago in favor of social obligations. He spent mornings walking in the park, listening to the rustling of the leaves and watching the world wake up. He started meditating, allowing his mind to settle into stillness rather than cluttering it with unnecessary chatter. He realized that peace didn't come from being constantly busy. It came from finding moments of quiet, of reflection, of solitude. As Richard began to reclaim his time, he noticed something remarkable. His life became richer, not because he was constantly surrounded by people, but because he was finally spending his time in alignment with what truly mattered. The quality of his experiences improved, and he found a deeper connection to himself. Instead of chasing external validation or fulfilling obligations, he embraced the freedom to choose what was truly fulfilling. He was no longer living for the approval of others. He was living for his own peace and contentment. Through this shift, In perspective, Richard learned that time is not something to be squandered on obligations or distractions. It is a finite resource, and how we choose to spend it determines the quality of our lives. When we start valuing our time and using it intentionally, we begin to live more fully, more authentically. We let go of the need to please others and instead focus on what brings us true joy and peace. As we age, the realization that time is limited becomes a guiding force. The pressure to attend every event, to meet every social obligation, and to constantly be active fades away. What remains is the desire to live in a way that is true to who we are, to make time for what nourishes our soul, and to embrace the simplicity and beauty of life's small moments. We start to recognize that the most fulfilling experiences are often the quietest ones, the moments spent in nature, the time spent with loved ones, and the time we give to ourselves. When we begin to value our time, we let go of the expectations and obligations that once dictated our actions. We stop chasing after fleeting distractions and instead focus on what truly matters. We choose quality over quantity, depth over surface-level connections, and peace over busyness. In doing so, we reclaim our time, and with it, our freedom. Richard's story is a reminder that as we age, we have the power to decide how we spend our time. We no longer need to fill our days with things that don't serve us. We can choose to invest our time in what brings us joy, peace, and fulfillment. Time, when spent wisely, becomes a precious gift, one that we can cherish and use to create the life we truly want. So, take a moment to reflect on how you are spending your time. Are you filling your days with things that truly matter to you, or are you simply going through the motions? If you find that your time is being consumed by obligations that no longer align with your values, it may be time to take a step back and ask yourself, how do I want to spend the rest of my time? When you start living with intention, when you begin to prioritize what truly matters, you will find that your life becomes richer, more meaningful, and full of peace. Time is precious. Use it wisely, and you will create a life that is truly worth living. 5. The beauty of impermanency. As we go through life, we often find ourselves searching for companionship in others, believing that our happiness is tied to the presence of friends, family, or romantic partners. We're taught that to be whole, we need to be surrounded by people who validate us, who affirm our worth, and who make us feel like we belong. However, as we grow older, especially in our later years, we begin to realize that true companionship doesn't necessarily come from the external world. It is not something we find by seeking others. It is something we cultivate within ourselves. True companionship is about being comfortable with our own company, about learning to love ourselves without needing constant reassurance or external approval. Eleanor, a woman in her late 70s, had spent much of her life seeking validation from the people around her. She was always the one who made an effort to keep up with friends, family, and acquaintances. She feared that without these connections, she would be lonely, that she would lose her sense of purpose and identity. As time passed, however, Eleanor began to feel a quiet emptiness in her life. Despite being surrounded by people, she had countless interactions, but many of them felt shallow and disconnected. She realized that she was often playing a role, being who others expected her to be, rather than being her true self. She was so busy trying to maintain these relationships, often out of fear of being alone, that she neglected the most important relationship of all, the one with herself. One evening, after yet another exhausting dinner party, where the same conversations were recycled, Eleanor sat quietly in her living room. She asked herself a question that she had never truly considered before. Am I really enjoying this? For the first time, she allowed herself to answer honestly. No, she was not enjoying the superficial chatter, the forced smiles, or the obligatory attendance at events. What she longed for was something deeper, a connection that didn't require pretense, a sense of belonging that wasn't dependent on the approval of others. She realized that she had spent so much of her life trying to fit in, trying to meet others' expectations, that she had lost touch with who she really was. This realization was both liberating and unsettling. Eleanor knew that she needed to make a change. She couldn't continue living for others, and she couldn't keep pretending that the relationships she had were enough to fill the emptiness she felt inside. So, she made the difficult decision to embrace solitude. She began spending more time alone, not out of loneliness but out of choice. At first, the silence was uncomfortable. She was not used to being with herself for extended periods, and the quietness of her own thoughts felt strange. But as the days went by, Eleanor began to discover the profound beauty of solitude. It was in these moments alone that she began to reconnect with herself. Eleanor took long walks through the park, observing the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the way the wind gently rustled the leaves, and the peaceful rhythm of her own footsteps. She started reading books she had always meant to read, but never had the time for, allowing herself to be fully immersed in the stories. She spent hours painting, a hobby she had abandoned years ago. In these solitary moments, Eleanor realized something deeply significant. She wasn't missing anything by being alone. In fact, she was gaining something even more precious, a deep sense of inner peace and a stronger connection to who she truly was. She began to understand that true companionship doesn't come from others, it comes from within. We are not defined by the number of people in our lives or by the social roles we play. We are defined by our ability to be content with ourselves, to find fulfillment in our own company, and to live authentically without needing constant validation. In a world that constantly tells us that happiness is found in relationships and social interactions, Eleanor discovered that true happiness is found in the quiet moments of reflection, in the peace that comes from within. Over time, Eleanor's perspective shifted. She no longer felt the pressure to be socially active or to maintain relationships out of obligation. She stopped saying yes to every invitation and started saying yes to herself. She no longer felt the need to prove her worth through external validation. The relationships that truly mattered to her remained, but she no longer relied on them for her sense of self. Instead, she found companionship in the simplest of moments, watching the sunset, savoring a cup of tea, or simply being present with her own thoughts. Through this journey, Eleanor learned that solitude is not loneliness, but a space where we can reconnect with our true selves. In the silence, we find clarity. In the stillness, we find our inner wisdom. True companionship is not about filling our lives with people, but about learning to be fully present with ourselves, to embrace who we are, and to love ourselves without seeking approval from others. When we are comfortable in our own company, when we no longer feel the need to be validated by others, we find a sense of peace and fulfillment that cannot be taken away. The beauty of this realization is that it frees us from the need to constantly seek external validation. We no longer need to measure our worth by the number of friends we have or the level of social engagement in our lives. Instead, we measure our worth by how at peace we are with ourselves, how deeply we are connected to our own hearts, and how authentically we live our lives. True companionship is not about being surrounded by people. It is about being fully connected to ourselves, fully comfortable in our own skin. As Eleanor's story shows, we don't need to be surrounded by others to feel complete. Solitude, when embraced with an open heart, can lead to profound self-discovery and inner peace. True companionship begins within, and once we cultivate that inner connection, the right relationships naturally follow. We no longer need to seek validation or approval. We find comfort in knowing that we are enough, just as we are. In the end, true companionship is not about the number of people in our lives, but about how deeply we are connected to ourselves. When we learn to embrace solitude, we unlock a new level of peace and fulfillment that cannot be found in any external relationship. It is in this space of self-acceptance and inner peace that we find the truest form of companionship. 6. Letting go of what doesn't serve you. As we navigate through life, we accumulate not only experiences but also burdens, expectations, obligations, and attachments that often weigh us down. We carry these burdens, sometimes unknowingly, thinking that they are essential parts of our identity. These attachments can manifest in many forms: the relationships we feel obligated to maintain, the societal roles we feel compelled to fulfill, or even the possessions we cling to in an attempt to define who we are. But as we grow older, especially as we approach our later years, we begin to feel the burden of these attachments more acutely. We begin to realize that in holding on to these things, we are not living freely. We are being dragged by the weight of things that no longer serve us. Letting go is not a process of loss, but one of gaining freedom, clarity, and a deeper connection to who we are. It is a release from the constraints we have imposed on ourselves, a step toward living authentically and with intention. Letting go is not easy. It requires courage to face the discomfort of shedding old habits, relationships, and identities that no longer serve our true selves. But in that discomfort lies the opportunity for growth, transformation, and a life of true freedom. Consider James Pan, a man in his late 70s, who had spent most of his life maintaining an active social calendar, believing that being constantly surrounded by people was the key to happiness. For decades, James filled his days with gatherings, parties, and social events, thinking that this was how one stayed connected to life, how one remained vibrant and engaged. But as the years passed, he began to feel exhausted. The conversations felt repetitive, the gatherings lacked depth, and he found himself attending events not out of desire, but out of obligation. The once joyful connections he had were now draining, and he began to question the true value of these interactions. One evening, after yet another tiring dinner with a group of acquaintances, James found himself staring at the flickering candle in the center of the table. The room was filled with laughter, but James was not laughing. He wasn't even fully present. His mind wandered as he questioned why he was there at all. What was the point of these social engagements? Why was he spending his time this way, when deep down, he felt no connection to the people around him? It was in this moment of realization that James understood something profound. He didn't need this anymore. He didn't need to force himself to maintain relationships that no longer brought him joy. He didn't need to say yes to every invitation out of guilt or fear of being left out. He had spent years trying to live up to external expectations, trying to please others, and in doing so, he had lost touch with what truly mattered to him. He was living for others, not for himself. So, James made the bold decision to let go. He began to decline invitations that no longer aligned with his values or desires. He stopped attending gatherings out of obligation and instead chose to spend his time doing things that brought him peace and fulfillment. He took up painting, a hobby he had abandoned long ago. He started taking long walks through the park, listening to the birds, feeling the sunlight on his face. He spent more time reading, diving into books that had sat on his shelf for years, untouched. Slowly, James began to realize that, in letting go of the pressure to constantly socialize and meet others' expectations, he had made space for what truly mattered: his own well-being, his own happiness. This process of letting go wasn't without its challenges. James initially felt a sense of guilt, wondering if people would notice his absence, if they would judge him for stepping away from the social scene. But as time passed, he realized that life didn't stop just because he chose to reclaim his time. No one judged him for saying no to events or turning down invitations. In fact, people respected him more for setting boundaries and living according to his own values. James discovered that the freedom he had been searching for was not in maintaining a busy social calendar or fulfilling every external obligation. It was in the decision to release what no longer served him and embrace a life of greater authenticity. Through this process, James found a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. He realized that letting go wasn't about was about reclaiming his freedom. It was about choosing to live life on his own terms, without the weight of unnecessary attachments. By shedding the expectations and obligations he had carried for so long, James created space for a deeper, more meaningful connection to himself and the world around him. This story of letting go is a reminder that we all have the power to release what no longer serves us. It's easy to become attached to things, whether it's relationships, material possessions, or the approval of others, because we believe they define us. But the truth is, they don't. We define ourselves by how we choose to live, by the choices we make, and by the authenticity with which we approach life. Letting go is not a loss. It is a gain of freedom, clarity, and peace. As we age, the process of letting go becomes more natural. As we realize that time is precious and we can no longer afford to waste it on things that don't bring us joy, we begin to understand that the weight of our attachments, whether to people, things, or societal expectations, holds us back from fully experiencing the present moment. Letting go frees us from the past, from the need to prove ourselves, and from the fear of losing something that isn't truly ours to begin with. When we let go, we allow ourselves to live fully, authentically, and with intention. We stop living for others and start living for ourselves. We let go of the need to fill every moment with activity, with people, or with things. Instead, we embrace the simplicity of life, the beauty of solitude, and the freedom to be exactly who we are. This is the true gift of letting go, the gift of living a life that is truly ours to create. In the end, letting go is not about giving up, it's about giving ourselves the freedom to live a life that is meaningful, fulfilling, and authentic. It is about shedding the weight of unnecessary burdens and making space for what truly matters. Let go of what no longer serves you, and you will discover a life that is lighter, more peaceful, and full of endless possibilities. In the journey of life, our character, James, learned that true freedom and peace come not from clinging to the past or fulfilling external expectations, but from the power of letting go. For years, James was caught up in the whirlwind of social obligations, constantly attending gatherings and maintaining relationships out of a sense of duty. However, as he grew older, he realized that these activities drained him, leaving him feeling unfulfilled and disconnected from his true self. By deciding to let go of the relationships and commitments that no longer brought him joy, James created space for a more authentic and peaceful life. Through painting, nature walks, and quiet reflection, he rediscovered the joy of living on his own terms. The key lesson James imparted is that letting go of attachments, whether to people, expectations, or habits, is not a loss, but a gain. It opens the door to a life filled with clarity, purpose, and self-fulfillment. The lesson from James's story is clear. Don't let societal pressures dictate your happiness. Embrace the freedom of choosing what truly brings you peace and joy. Let go of what no longer serves you, and make room for a life that aligns with your authentic self. If you found value in this story, consider subscribing to our channel to support more inspiring content. Your support motivates us to keep creating meaningful stories for you. The greatest gift of aging is the ability to let go, to release the attachments, expectations, and obligations that no longer serve us. As we let go, we create space for something even greater, the freedom to live on our own terms, to embrace solitude, and to find true fulfillment within ourselves. Remember, true peace doesn't come from the number of friends we have. It comes from how at peace we are with ourselves. Let go of what no longer serves you, and you'll find that the greatest freedom is not in holding on, but in releasing. In the journey of life, our character, James, learned that true freedom and peace come not from clinging to the past or fulfilling external expectations, but from the power of letting go. For years, James was caught up in the whirlwind of social obligations, constantly attending gatherings and maintaining relationships out of a sense of duty. However, as he grew older, he realized that these activities drained him, leaving him feeling unfulfilled and disconnected from his true self. By deciding to let go of the relationships and commitments that no longer brought him joy, James created space for a more authentic and peaceful life. Through painting, nature walks, and quiet reflection, he rediscovered the joy of living on his own terms. The key lesson James imparted is that letting go of attachments, whether to people, expectations, or habits, is not a loss, but a gain. It opens the door to a life filled with clarity, purpose, and self-fulfillment. The lesson from James's story is clear. Don't let societal pressures dictate your happiness. Embrace the freedom of choosing what truly brings you peace and joy. Let go of what no longer serves you, and make room for a life that aligns with your authentic self. If you found value in this story, consider subscribing to our channel to support more inspiring content. Your support motivates us to keep creating meaningful stories for you.